Hello and welcome to this Institute for Government webinar looking at civil service location, grade, pay and morale. I'm Emma Norris, the Deputy Director of IFG. So this webinar is the final one in a series of 3. Hopefully lots of you joined us to discuss the size and shape of the civil service and recruitment and turnover. We've been using the discussion so far to draw out and discuss some of the key findings from our recently published Whitehall Monitor report. As hopefully everybody knows by now, Whitehall Monitor is our annual data-driven report on the state of the civil service. In January every year, we look at how the civil service has changed over the previous 12 months and the kind of challenges we think it's going to be facing in the coming year. And we're very pleased to have partnered with PA Consulting for the report. In this discussion, we're going to be looking at efforts to move officials out of London. We're going to be looking at the link between civil service pay and changing grade structures. And then finally, we'll be talking a bit about how officials are feeling about their jobs. I'm delighted to be joined by Jack Warledge, a senior researcher at the IFG and the lead author of this year's Whitehall Monitor, Theodore Grammer, who's a research assistant on our civil service team, and Hannah Keenan, an associate director on the civil service team. In terms of how the event is going to work, exactly the same as the others. In a moment, Jack and Theodore are going to take us through some of the key findings from this year's report. Hannah and Jack are then going to offer us a few extra reflections, but I'm going to make sure that we leave lots of time for Q&A. So do start thinking about the questions that you have on these topics. Submit them any time from now using the Slido function, and I'll make sure we spend a good half an hour on those. Okay, Jack, I'm going to hand over to you to take us through some of the data.
Emma. So yes, as Emma said, I'm going to take us through some of the key findings of this year's Whitehall Monitor report. And I'm going to go through these slides relatively quickly, as Emma said, to try to allow plenty of time for discussion and questions at the end. So I'm going to start by looking at the location of civil servants. And I think this is particularly interesting at this point because relocating civil servants outside of London was a big reform priority, arguably the biggest reform priority under recent Conservative governments. And it's something that the Institute has always very much supported. We think it's good for attracting different types of people into the civil service, offering different perspectives into policy making. And there's also some evidence that more cross-departmental collaboration happens in some of the regional offices that have been set up. Just quickly on the numbers, the target that was set in 2019 was for 22,000 roles to be moved outside of London by 2030. There was good progress on that, and the target was moved forward to 2027. And we think, based on the latest numbers, we're very close to that 22,000 target being reached. And because it's a slight lagging indicator, we think that target has was probably already reached by last year's stats by the time they came out. In terms of what this chart that I'm sharing now shows, this shows the percentage change in numbers of civil servants since 2010 by region. And what you can see here is sort of the story of what happened in these regions as the civil service first shrank between 2010 and 2016, and then started growing afterwards. So as the civil service shrank, all regions saw steeper cuts in civil service numbers than London did. But then as the civil service started to grow again, London bounced back more strongly, but also crucially from a higher base. So really the story here is the civil service over most of the time we're looking at this chart becoming more heavily weighted in London, more London centric. And the progress that's been made in relocation that I just talked about, those 22,000 roles being relocated has only really come in more recent years. This next chart sort of shows where we are now or where we were in 2024, which is where the latest numbers were from. You can see on the left-hand side there, 20% of the entire civil service, of the 500,000 or so officials in the civil service, are based in London. But the interesting thing comes when you look at how that differs by grade. And really the concentration in London gets a lot more significant as you get more senior through the grade structure. At the most junior level, the AA, AO level, those officials are relatively well spread out across the country in different regions, but far less so as you go up the grades until you get to 64% of the senior civil service being based in London last year. So definitely some more progress to be made there. And for the next few slides, we're going to talk about the related issues of how civil service pay and the grade structure of the civil service have changed over recent years. We're going to start with the grade structure. So you can see here the changing numbers of civil servants by grade between 2010 and last year. And as the civil service shrank, almost all of the shrinkage in the civil service between 2010 and 2016 was in the junior, the most junior roles. Again, those AO and AA roles. And as the civil service then started to grow post 2016, interestingly, that loss of junior grades, they weren't replaced, and actually the growth came at the more sort of mid-level and senior grades. So by the time we got to 2024, we had about 100,000 fewer AOs and AAs, a 45% reduction in that grade between 2010 and 2024. But in terms of the growth of the civil service between 2016 and 2024, the proportion, the numbers of SEOs and HEOs went up by 62%, and the sort of more mid-level, sort of pushing up to the senior civil service, the grade 6s and 7s, the numbers of those officials increased by 106%, and so more than doubled between 2016 and 2024. The overall result being that the civil service, as a result, is now far more heavily weighted towards the sort of medium, mid-level and more senior ranks. We're then going to look quickly at what's happened to civil service pay over the same time period. This shows the percentage change in pay, both of the civil service overall and by grade in real terms since 2010. And what you can see here is that the civil service pay overall, that black line near the top of the chart, is very nearly back to 2010 levels in real terms. That's overall civil service pay. But then if you look at what's happened at individual grades, actually there's been a lot of erosion in pay as a result of inflation. So if you look at the senior civil service, for example, at the bottom of the chart, the senior civil service has seen almost 25% reduction in real terms pay since 2010. And it's worth saying as well that for all these grades, you can see the slight uptick between 23 and 24 as a result of the Sunak government's pay deal. Now, if we bear that in mind, what's happened to the changing pay by grade across the civil service, and go back to the previous chart that I shared on grade structure, we tried to think about, why has this happened? What is the link between these two charts? And we think that it's undeniable, to try to shift the presentation back, that some of this reduction in the most junior grades would have been down to automation, more use of digital technology in the civil service. But given that those reductions in pay, we think it's clear that a significant amount of this is a result of grade inflation. So officials being promoted earlier than it otherwise would have been, as the only way, crucially, for managers to give their reports a pay rise. So that was one of the particularly interesting things coming out of this year's Whitehall Monitor. And I'll just move us forward again to this last chart of this section, where we tried to identify how much this grade inflation has actually cost the civil service. There is a cost to all this. And so we've compared here what civil service pay actually was which is the black line there, in every year since 2010, adjusting into 2024 prices. And we've compared that to what it would have been under a couple of different scenarios. And the key line here is the dashed blue line, which shows what the overall civil service pay would have been in each year if the average pay for each grade the average pay for each grade changed as it did between those years, but crucially, if the grade structure was unchanged. So without that shift in grade structure towards more mid-level and senior ranks that I just showed, what you can see by the time we get to 2024, we've got that gap, which shows a gap of 1.9 billion pounds between the solid black line and the dashed blue line. So grade inflation by 2024 was costing the civil service almost 2 billion pounds annually. So a real cost to that there. So that's some of the story about location of civil servants and about pay and grade and the relationship between them. And I think I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Theodore, who's going to talk a bit more about morale. So over to Theodore.
Thanks, Jack, for that. So, as many of you will know, the civil service collects data on officials' morale and views on their working experience through the annual People Survey. There was a very welcome new release of the People Survey on the 30th of January for the last year, so for 2024. So we've updated all of our charts in light of that. And I think it's worth flagging before we dig into what the data shows. That data is collected in September, October of every year. So this is the first data that we're getting since the new government has come into office. This first chart shows the engagement score for all civil servants. So this is the headline measure of morale within the People Survey, and it shows it from 2010 to 2024. Broadly speaking, the story is one of morale being on an increasing trend until 3 consecutive years of declines that started in 2021, and of it rising slightly in 2024, but still remaining below 2021 levels. So reasons to be cautiously optimistic, but still not sort of recovered to the peak in terms of engagement scores that was registered in 2020. Can we go to the next slide, please? This next chart shows sort of the wealth of data that can come out of the People Survey. So there are various themes that group the questions that are asked in the People Survey and get sort of civil servants' opinions on organizational objectives and purpose, on their own work, on the L&D offer within the civil service, inclusion and fair treatment, and a bunch of other things. This chart shows how official satisfaction has changed over time. So since 2010 until this latest release from 2024, how their satisfaction has changed in relation to these various elements. And the story is, broadly speaking, a positive one. Satisfaction with most of these elements has tended to trend upwards, but there are several quite notable exceptions. A first one is pay, which reflects some of the discussion that we've just had with the previous charts that Jack talked about. Satisfaction is generally very low with pay, which is unsurprising given some of the trends that we've looked at. Satisfaction with pay and benefits fell in 2024 after rising a little bit following the Sunak government's pay deal, which was announced in summer 2023 and was then registered in the People Survey in the following autumn. Apart from that, there's also something more to say about leadership and managing change. Again, there seems to be quite a bit of dissatisfaction in the civil service around that. It fell for the 4th consecutive year in 2024. Could we go to the last slide on morale, which looks at engagement scores for civil servants by department and how they changed between the last year and this year, actually the last 2 years, the last 2 releases of the People Survey. The key point, we think, is that morale has ticked upwards. This is sort of reflects what we've been talking about a little bit earlier. In most departments, it's gone up by a little bit, and in certain departments, the change is quite substantial. In particular, DHSC and DESNES, in both of those departments, more than 5 percentage point increases were recorded. The other important thing from our point of view is this is the first year that we get year-on-year data for the 3 newest departments, so DBT, DSIT, and DESNES, and it's encouraging to see that morale has ticked up in all 3 of those departments. We noted in our Whitehall Monitor report in particular that DSIT had struggled to achieve the morale levels of its predecessor department in DCMS, so this is an encouraging development overall. So this has been sort of a quick overview of some of the latest data on morale, and we hope that this presentation has given a fairly good sense of the top lines from our Whitehall Monitor reports. I think I'll stop now and I'll hand back to Emma.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Theodore. Thanks, Jack. Hannah, I want to come to you first and hear a few of your reflections on what we've just heard from the data. And in particular, how do you think some of the kind of big messages, the big findings that Jack and Theodore have just taken us through relate to what we've heard recently from the Prime Minister and from Pat McFadden about the approach to civil service reform that they're going to be taking?
Thank you. And thank you so much, Jack and Theodore, for talking us through all of that. There's a huge amount that we could draw on there. I suppose the thing that I am interested in picking up is, Theodore, some of what you were talking about in terms of how you link morale and some of the stuff that we heard, Emma, as you said, from the Prime Minister and from Pat McFadden, Prime Minister's speech on Thursday last week, and from Pat McFadden the weekend before. If we take that reform question, when talking about civil service reform, the Prime Minister has been using some really kind of positive language to set out the big vision on civil service reform. He's been talking about fantastic civil servants, being frustrated by the system they're stuck in. This is quite a big shift in tone from what we saw in December when Keir Starmer released the plan for change and famously talked about civil servants being comfortable in their tepid bath of managed decline. And I think we really welcome seeing, that shift in language and that view to working alongside civil servants to get a state that, in Starmer's words on Thursday, is operating at maximum power. And we know from our discussions, from our research, civil servants are frustrated by the system they're in, and they want the state to be operating at maximum power. So really good to see the PM positioning himself alongside the civil service to try and get that reform. We know that's something civil servants will want to do. I think alongside that, picking up on this morale point that Theodore, you spoke us through, the government does need to bear in mind that, yes, we've seen an uptick in morale, but that is after 3 years of decline. And that it is a small uptick. As you said, it's not yet back at 2021 levels. And I'd also like to dig in to that point that you mentioned about leadership and managing change. Civil service reform will require really, really strong leadership. It will be a big change programme. And I think seeing that there isn't yet satisfaction or high levels of satisfaction, certainly a decrease in it with leadership and managing change, gives the government something to really look at in terms of how they talk about their reform plan. So what I would say is that the vision on civil service reform is really there. The government needs to think carefully about how you maintain civil service morale as you reform, and getting strong leadership, good change management will be crucial to that. And as part of that, we need to set out a plan for what that reform looks like in practice.
Brilliant. Thank you, Hannah. We've got lots of questions coming through, particularly on relocation. So I'm going to start there. One of the questions that's been asked lots of times is, how do we really, or how can government really go about motivating people to leave London if they do want a civil service that has more geographical spread? And particularly, how do we ensure that careers outside London can be just as meaningful as careers inside London? Access to the same opportunities, access to political decision makers, and so on. Who wants to jump in? Hannah, Jack? Oh, Jack, you're on mute. Oh, your sound isn't working at the moment, Jack. So I'm just going to go over to Hannah whilst you have a play with the technology.
I'll see if Jack can get his sound back working. But I mean, this is, I think, the question that successive governments have grappled with, and we've got some really good examples of how you do relocation well. So some of the work that the IFG has done in the research into the Darlington Economic Campus, that idea that you bring civil servants with similar policy anchors, so economics and trade, together into a single place. Get lots of collaboration across departments, that cross-fertilization of ideas, but also that crucial point of you are bringing senior decision makers and senior civil servants also relocating outside of London. I think that's a crucial thing, especially if you're looking at long-term career paths. If you're a junior civil servant looking at moving outside of London, great in terms of morale. Your pay is going to go further in terms of what it's going to get you, especially in terms of housing. You want to be able to see what your career path could look like in practice, and that includes having role models and having senior civil servants who are based outside of London. So some really good examples that the government can draw on from the Darlington Economic Campus there.
Thanks, Hannah. Theodore.
Yeah, that's totally right. Definitely in agreement with Hannah here. I would add there are already examples of many other places, even when there aren't sort of established institutional structures, such as in the Darlington Economic Campus, where civil servants are doing great work in terms of sort of building that sort of interdepartmental, cross-departmental ways of working outside of London. So one example is the Sheffield Policy Campus, which our colleague Sophie did a really, really, really good piece on recently. And there again, there are a lot of pathways pathways for people in the local area to sort of enter the civil service. And there's a lot of sort of a lot of things, a lot of good things happening in terms of creating those pathways. But again, the big problem is there needs to be more senior attention, and the centre needs to be more involved in sort of pushing that and supporting those sorts of projects with the institutional resources that they need to be even more successful than they currently are.
I'm just sticking with Darlington at the moment. I wonder are there any downsides to what's happened there? One of the questions coming through has been about whether there are any downsides to, for instance, Darlington only approaches to recruitment. Hannah, I don't know if you have any views on that. And then Jack, I'm going to come to you in a sec.
I think there's always a trade-off. And so you might find that you have a different set of people applying to roles in Darlington as you might do to roles in London. You might not. But I think the government, as with anything, needs to take the call on, what does it mean to start building up expertise in Darlington and to draw on kind of local resource. So possibly, but it might be that those are the right ones, and actually there will be big upsides that come from Darlington only recruitment as well. I think Theodore, as he was talking, prompted me, reminded me that I heard Pat McFadden on the BBC recently talking about how much he valued the second Cabinet Office headquarters in Glasgow. And I think that's a point that we need to be careful not to miss as well. It's about senior people being located outside of London. It's also about ministers, valuing the civil servants who are based outside of London as well, and working, being happy to work remotely with them. We've seen some really good examples of that. But it sort of comes from both the political and the civil service side at the top.
Hannah. Jack, I want to come to you on another relocation question. How do we make sure that the growth in areas outside London is real and not just paper growth? So somebody gives an example of London or Southeast based colleagues really continuing to be based in London, even if officially they're recorded as being based in other locations. Something that this person says happens a lot, or but that's not something we have data on. Jack, does any of that ring true? And if so, how do we ensure that growth in other regions is genuine?
I hope my sound is now working. If you can.
Yes, it is.
Brilliant. Sorry, my leaving the webinar and coming back in. Sorry about that, but that helped. So I've caught a few bits of that discussion on relocation. And to answer that question, the first thing I would say is to reiterate the importance of what I heard Hannah was talking about as I came back in, of leadership and making sure that people can have fulfilling roles with real career progression in these sort of, whether they're regional offices or other places outside of London, and making sure that both ministerial and civil service leadership are willing to treat colleagues who don't work in London as give them just as much input into the policy making process as anyone in London has. Being happy to have virtual discussions, having people sort of being beamed in from around the country. So treating relocation seriously and not treating it as a yes, we want this to happen on paper, but actually as soon as I want a meeting, I want everyone in the room with me. That's something that really does need to happen. So it's a leadership point. So that goes some way to hopefully answer the challenge of paper growth. People should be comfortable, ministerial and civil service leadership, with actually really having these people based elsewhere and still being able to make a meaningful contribution. The other point I would make, which that reminds me of, is on the data that we have, is something that I was thinking of bringing into the slides but didn't quite have time, was that on the 22,000 relocation, there's been some discussion over whether that's just sort of officials being moved out of London or whether it's new roles being created elsewhere. So is it relocation or is it just jobs being created in other regions? And as far as I'm aware, we've never had a clear explanation of how the government statistics on number of roles relocated are actually calculated. And it's something that select committees have picked up on and sort of pushed for more clarity on. So that's something that we absolutely need. 22,000, there's clearly been some progress, the charts and the data shows that, but quite how much progress is slightly difficult to tell until we have more clarity on exactly how it's being measured.
Brilliant, thanks, Jack. And then one last question broadly related to relocation, then I want to move on to some other subjects. What's the relationship between the kind of drive for civil servants to spend more time back in the office, back in the kind of physical locations, and the simultaneous desire to see more civil servants moving outside London? Are those two things coherent, incoherent, unrelated? What does the panel think? Who wants to jump in?
I'm happy to jump in first on that. I think they can. I think they can absolutely be coherent because I think that. I mean, to start with our view on the 60% sort of in-office requirement, we think that's absolutely sensible. It was worked out on the basis of matching, what the private sector, by and large, is offering now post-pandemic, because obviously the civil service does need to compete with the private sector. It's important to say that is a cross civil service number. It does still give, and rightly so, different departments and teams within departments, latitude to adjust to their, adjust to what makes sense for them. So it's not a hard and fast rule. But the sort of side of the discussion that really emphasises the importance of being in the office as much as possible. It's just about collaboration with the rest of your team, learning from people. It being particularly important for more junior staff, younger staff to create networks and learn from their peers. So in theory, that shouldn't matter whether you're in London or if you're elsewhere. Being in a work environment where you are located with your peers and learning from them and working as a team shouldn't matter where you are all located physically. So yeah, in theory, the others might have other thoughts, but absolutely compatible.
And as you want to jump in?
Well, I suppose on that point about it being totally compatible, I think sometimes in Whitehall, because you've got these departments that have often their own buildings in London, and your department sits in your building, you might be co-located with some other departments, but even in big offices where you might have, let's say, MHCLG, DEFRA and the Home Office all in the same building, they're in different wings, and there's a different feel when you walk into different wings of that building. And actually, I think we know from some of our research into other locations outside of London, there's not that same physical silo between different departments. And so actually in-office working can offer you a slightly different type of collaboration. We spoke about this sort of cross-departmental as well. And if you can see that around things, that starts to break down some of the silos between departments is really, really beneficial.
Thank you. Okay, I want to talk a bit about pay and grade now. Hannah, I'm going to come to you first. The recent performance and obviously kind of budgetary reforms that we're seeing, do you think that those are going to be kind of more or less conducive to more competitive pay for civil servants, and in particular to competitive pay at the SCS level?
Quite a tricky question there. I mean, I think we've seen that pay hasn't kept pace with private sector pay. I think we're in a fairly tight fiscal environment. And so I won't make any kind of predictions or suggestions about what moves, but I do think I will come back to what Jack was talking about our understanding that we do think a lot of grade inflation is happening, certainly at the more junior roles. So there's a little bit less scope for it to happen within the senior civil service, just because of fewer rungs on the ladder, if you will, in the senior civil service. But among more junior roles, and I think this will feed through, as Jack said, we're seeing either jobs being advertised at a higher grade than they might otherwise have been, or individuals being moved into higher grade roles faster than they might otherwise have been, because civil servants are trying to find a way to reward people who are performing well. And that is, of course, a thing that civil servants will want to do, and is the right thing to do to try and keep people in post for longer. So you're trying often to address some issues of churn, which is what we've spoken about in the past. So I think really the thing that I want to get at there is, and it sounds like this is what the Prime Minister and Pat McFadden wants to get at, and we know that it's what civil servants want to get at. How do you incentivize people to do the thing that they already want to do in the civil service, to stay in their roles, to build expertise, to be able to progress within those roles? And how do you reward them to do that? So you need to be able to pay people competitively to do that. you also need to be producing kind of roles that feel fulfilling to individuals. And I think grade inflation certainly stores up some problems on that front as well.
And I want to stick with that relationship between grade inflation and morale for a moment and really understand a bit more about the relationship between the two. Theodore, Hannah, Jack, I'll be interested in all of your views on this. On the one hand, if grade inflation is happening because it's a route for trying to improve pay and give a sense of progression, you might expect that to lead to increased morale in civil servants who experience that. On the other hand, if people are being promoted perhaps more readily than they might have been some years ago, that could raise challenges for capability, leading to a decrease in morale. What are your views on the relationship between grade inflation and morale? Jack, you've got your hand up. I'll come to you first.
So the interesting thing about this is there's an assumption in that question as to seniority and remuneration feeding morale, because logically it would. Actually, to hark back slightly to the previous Whitehall Monitor, Whitehall Monitor 2024, we did do a bit of work in that, trying to look at the correlation between headline morale statistics and satisfaction with different of the theme scores that Theodore was talking about. And actually, we found that there isn't a very strong correlation between overall morale and pay. There's actually very poor or almost no correlation at all, which it's slightly tricky to tease out why that might be. It could be because there are ingrained expectations of low pay, and officials to some extent accept that. They might not be happy about it, but it's not the thing that is forefront of their mind when they're thinking about how engaged they are overall. And Theodore talked about the successive declines in satisfaction with leadership and managing change. So I think it's difficult to say, this much of morale is this and this much of morale is that. We can't really do that. But I would point perhaps slightly more towards churn, as in the churn in sort of direction, political direction, machinery of government changes, those kind of things which disrupt civil servants' kind of like day-to-day lives, and the idea of sort of constantly changing direction. I'd point a bit more towards some of that than I would necessarily just pay. But of course, not to suggest that pay is not a very significant factor, as we talked about.
Really interesting. Thanks, Jack. Hannah.
Just building on what Jack has said, some of the factors beyond pay. Emma, coming to your question about grade inflation and its relationship to morale, I think, let's say that you're a civil servant who's recently become a higher executive officer, and you might be hearing, oh well, HEOs did a lot more work, 10 years ago. They're responsible for a lot more things. That type of
exactly
narrative.
That question sitting in front of me, Hannah, coming up.
And civil servants want to do meaningful, stretching work. They are overwhelmingly in the job because they want to make a contribution to society, and being told that actually you're not doing as much as someone 10 years before you was doing in that role cannot be good for morale. So I think there's something in there, and I think also this isn't happening consistently. So we've called here for for the professions to set out, specific standards and requirements of profession, to link pay to that. And part of that could actually be really helpful in terms of grade inflation, to set the standards a bit more across the whole of government and the whole of the civil service on what different professions expect at different grades. I think the other point I wanted to make was that the civil service is enormous and comprised of all sorts of, very, very different groups of civil servants and different departments. But coming back to, again, Jack and Theodore, your points about leadership and managing change, which I think are really key in this, you could take an individual department and it might be that something totally unrelated to pay or grade inflation is changing morale there. The Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office is a really interesting example here. And if you dig into that, you see quite a big dip in morale, sort of 2020, when the two departments got merged. You then see a bit of an uptick again, and you can look at what's happening in that department. You see the appointment of second permanent secretary, Nick Dye, who's a development professional there. You see kind of the change in the way that merger was being handled. So you can't say that it's just pay. There's so many different bits, and different civil servants will be impacted by totally different things on morale.
Brilliant. Thanks, Hannah. You mentioned individual departments, and Theodore, I want to come back to you on this. You showed some differences in some departments, DESNES, DHSC, kind of standing out on the morale scores. What does that tell us about what's happening? Do we know what's happening and what's driving that in the individual departments that appear to be performing better, or indeed those departments that appear to be performing a little bit below average?
So I think this goes back to the wealth of data that exists out there in the Civil Service People Survey. So the People Survey has many questions, and each of those themes, sort of the theme score is based on several sort of very specific questions. So just to give some examples, in the leadership and managing change theme there, the sorts of questions that are asked are whether the actions of senior managers are consistent with the organization's values, or whether a given official has confidence in the decisions made by a certain organization's senior managers, right? So we can sort of, there's a lot to unpick there in terms of individual departments, and you can sometimes really see what is happening and which one of the themes is driving down the overall engagement score, so the overall headline measure for morale. Now, the question of what is driving those changes in scores is a bit trickier, right? It really does depend. What's also worth flagging is there are different levels, different response rates in different organizations and in different departments. And sometimes the average respondent to the People Survey is not the same as the average civil servant, right? So, for example, some of the demographic data that we've seen in last year's, the demographic breakdown for the People Survey results this year has not been released yet. But in 2023, we saw that higher grades within the civil service were overrepresented in the sample of people who responded to the People Survey. We saw that, for example, ethnic minorities in the civil service were underrepresented in terms of the sample of respondents. So when you have that skewed sample, there are certain sort of caveats, and so you have to start taking the results of the People Survey with a grain of salt. And obviously, there's a lot more sort of variation at the level of individual departments. And I think one last thing that I would flag is data that is not publicly available, but that does exist out there in the system, is sort of even more granular data at team level, right? You do have that within the civil service. You do sort of have that more granular responses, meaning that it's a really sort of helpful tool for internal management within the civil service for working out what's going well, what's going less well, and where sort of the big sort of areas for change are. But unfortunately, that's not data that we have access to and that we can really unpick at the IFG.
Thanks, Theodore. Jack, Hannah, a question that I'd be interested in both your answers on. Lots of people have asked a version of, what's the impact, do you think, of recent prime ministerial and ministerial statements on morale? So obviously we've had, the Prime Minister making the kind of positive case for reform, talking about, the need for active government, some really interesting things from Pat McFadden on kind of test and learn and encouraging innovation. But on the other hand, we also had the language around the tepid bath and so on. So what does this all add up to for morale? Jack, I'll come to you first.
I mean, the first thing I'd say is I don't want to tell any civil servants on the call how they might feel about anything that the Prime Minister or CDL might be saying. I mean, my starting point would be that I do think that comments, whatever the comments are, whether positive, negative, or whatever they might be saying, given what Hannah just said about how incredibly large the civil service is, how varied it is. Over half of all civil servants work in operational delivery, so frontline roles, which are not sitting in Whitehall, to core Whitehall departments, as a lot of people think of them. So the reason I say that is that it can feel quite removed. What the Prime Minister or senior ministers are saying can feel quite removed from your sort of day-to-day life. The challenge for civil service leaders and for political leaders is to make that feed down. You need something between the headline ambition, which they've been fairly good at setting out so far, and making that connect to how people are doing their roles day to day. So it can feel a bit disconnected. That's not to say that language doesn't matter, though. Of course, it really does. There was obviously pushback on the tepid bath comments. I feel like we knew where the Prime Minister was coming from on that, but it does show how important language is, and obviously previous ministers over the past sort of 5 years or so, since 2016 in some cases, we have had occasions where language has had a big impact, where some ministers could have thought a bit more carefully about it. So I guess I'll stop there slightly, but say it can have been a bit removed. It's important that reforms that ministers want to make do feed into people's day-to-day working experiences. But yes, language does matter. And I think Hannah looked like she wanted to come in, so I'll pass over to her.
I'm helpfully going to agree with absolutely everything you said, Jack. Language matters, and I think it's good that we have stopped hearing anything about sort of Project Chainsaw and this idea that we need to, take a Musk-like approach. That is absolutely not the right way to build trust and effectiveness of civil servants who, want to do reforms. I think, lots of civil servants will welcome some of the stuff and some of the detail that Pat McFadden was putting out around performance management, something that civil servants regularly raise as a thing that they want to be able to manage better in their teams, but don't have the tools to do so. So just to echo what Jack has said, I think the government is in the right place to bring the civil service with them. They set out a vision that is working alongside the civil service to do reforms that the civil service also wants to do. I think the real risk here is that we have heard good visions on civil service reform before. And I think civil servants have felt like, yeah, we're ready. But what the government really needs to do now is put the detail on that and to really get into the flesh of it. And I think if they don't start doing that, that's when you risk starting to lose the civil service and have that morale drop off again.
Brilliant. Thank you, Hannah. As this is our last webinar on Whitehall Monitor, I want to finish by asking each of the panelists a slightly bigger question that has come through. If you could pick one thing that would have a real impact on the effectiveness and productivity of the civil service to be part of a reform package, what would it be? Hannah, I'm going to unfairly pick on you first, I'm afraid.
And I'm going to very unfairly give it a bucket of things, which is all around high performance. Find a way to recognise your high performers, pay them more, incentivise them, find a way so that civil servants can manage poor performance and ultimately dismiss poor performers. It all has to be about performance for me.
Thank you. Jack?
Terrible thing about going second, I was going to say poor performers and incentivizing high performers and so on, because just to reiterate what Hannah said, you can't talk to any civil servant without them hearing about the difficulty that they have in managing poor performers and sort of the tarnished by association problem. I mean, in the absence of that, I would have to talk about turnover. And in fact, no, I might do two. I might do turnover, which we covered in the first webinar, which damages institutional memory. People always moving from one place to another, also disrupts projects and prevents people from gaining expertise they need to do their jobs well. And on that expertise point, somewhere where I do think the civil service has made progress in recent years, but attracting more experts in from outside government, being more sort of collaborative with the private sector, but also just getting better at interchange and making the civil service more sort of understandable and attractive to people who have expertise in the wider economy and being better at bringing them in.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jack. Theodore?
I guess echoing some of the themes that have already been picked up on, I think finding ways for pay progression that do not require people moving roles all the time or even moving teams and departments, I think is one of the key sort of solutions in terms of reducing some of the excessive turnover that we see across the civil service. And there are many other things that can be done around pay and that we've recommended before in our recent 20 Ways to Improve the Civil Service paper, including considering the introduction of a pay review body for civil servants below the SCS level. There are many things that can be done, many fixes that do not necessarily require sort of instant pay rises, but that sort of would help resolve some of the continuous issues and contentions around pay, we think.
Thank you, Theodore. We're at time, or just over time, so we're going to have to leave it there for today's webinar. Huge thanks to my IFG colleagues, Jack, Hannah and Theodore, and big thank you to everybody who's been watching and sending in lots of excellent questions. You can watch this webinar back at any time on our website. The audio is going to be up and running on our IFG events podcast feed sometime in the next few hours. As I said, this was the final webinar in our series of 3 looking at the findings of Whitehall Monitor. We've really enjoyed having these conversations, hearing the questions that listeners, that the audience want answered. If you missed any of the other webinars in the series, then please do watch them back on our website. Thanks very much for watching, and hopefully see you all at another IFG event very soon. Thank you.